Hi, it's me. We're going to learn a little bit about public land in the United States. What's going on with all that land? Here's a joke about a place that's got a lot of public land. Knock, knock. Who's there? Nevada. Nevada who? I Nevada saw you look so bad before. You should go to bed. Okay, let's talk about who's in charge of all these public lands in our great land of ours, the home of the land of the home of the free of the brave, the US of A. And the reality is public land is land that's owned by the U.S. government, which is owned by taxpayers, which is owned by you and me and everyone else. So there's a few agencies that operate land, but the main agency is the Department of the Interior. And they have a variety of different offices. And here in the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Bureau of Reclamation, all are operated under the Department of the Interior. And but there are a couple other agencies that operate public lands outside of that department. The main one is the Department of Agriculture. And yes, it does say the Forest Service. And yes, that doesn't make sense, but I didn't make the system, so don't call me. Hey, happy times in Sesame Street. So let's learn a little bit about all of these lands. We're going to start with the Department of the Interior one first, and we're going to start with the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM. Ooh la la. And the BLM is in charge of the most public land of any of the agencies. It has the most land under its umbrella. This land is mostly out west. There's essentially no BLM land east of the Mississippi. So we're not really familiar with it here in Minnesota, but if you lived out in Utah, Wyoming, you would definitely recognize the BLM. And the BLM land is basically looks like this, all right? A little bit of grazing land, a little bit of like rangeland, cowboy land. It kind of has that western mystique look to it. Ooh la la. Cattle roaming all over the place, and this is primarily what this land mostly is. And we call this rangeland, frequently land that's a little bit grassy, semi-arid, frequently used for grazing most often. But it could be used for farming and other purposes. And the BLM lands are typically used for multiple purposes, mainly grazing, but you could certainly mine on them, log on them. There's a wide array of activities, including camping, that can be done on them. All right, well, since we just mentioned rangelands and the BLM lands, we might as well go into a little bit more detail, if you don't mind. I certainly don't, so let's talk about it. And when we talk about rangelands and the people out west, what are they concerned with is overgrazing. That's most likely the thing that will happen to most lands out west in this type of situation. That's right, cow. You evil, go away. Stop eating so much, you fat girl. Don't give me that look. So, anywho, this is what most agencies are trying to deal with, particularly BLM, is managing the rangelands so they're not overgrazed. There's obviously other threats to these rangelands. Soil erosion, that comes with overgrazing. Loss of habitat, so development, water pollution, desertification from overgrazing, all sorts of stuff. This is the main theme of what takes over Western management systems on these lands. There is a law to manage grazing, the Taylor Grazing Act, and it says that grazers have to get a permit, but a lot of people feel it's not very strong enough at actually stopping this. And you can see here, there's a little picture when the cows don't graze and when they do, and you can see that overgrazing can take a very dramatic look. All right, another Department of Interior Land Management agency is the NPS, the National Park Service. And the National Park Service is pretty sweet because people like to go there because you know what's in the national parks? Pretty things, glittery things, fountainy things, Old Faithful things, tree things like General Sherman, or Archie things like an Arches National Park. These are considered like gems in the United States natural heritage and historic heritage because monuments commemorate historical times. And so the goal of the National Park Service and National Park lands is to preserve whatever's on those lands so that future generations can see it. So this means you can't just do whatever the heck you want to on a national park land. You cannot go stick a thing of dynamite down, Old Faithful and see what happens. It's just not allowed. It won't hold up to the long-term sustainability for future generations test. The other agencies that kind of have some hand in some land management as well as but not as much as the other ones, is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so they operate the National Wildlife Refuges, and so you would go to a refuge to go see wildlife. That's the whole goal. So most of these refuges are trying to preserve habitat. There's over 500 of them around the United States. A lot of them are designed to be key habitat sites for various wildlife populations. So you can, again, go stick a load of dynamite into the wetland and blow it up. You know, that kind of use is not allowed at the wildlife refuges, but you definitely can hunt, because the point of these was to give people closer chances to wildlife. So you can hunt and fish on those lands. The Bureau of Reclamation, we've mentioned before in the water unit, but this is a agency that was obsessed and still is obsessed with managing lands to help make water accessible to the western states primarily. So this is the agency that was primarily in charge of building all these dams. Remember, here it is, Glen Canyon. That's the dam that got everybody's panties in a bundle back in the 60s. And here's Lake Powell all backed up. So this is the agency out west that is going to be managing lands, but primarily is doing it under the guise of helping get water to accessible to various population centers. The next little sets of lands we're going to talk about is the Forest Service, the National Forest, National Grasslands, which are controlled by the, guess what, U.S. Forest Service. And guess who controls the U.S. Forest Service? The Department of Agriculture. Of course you say, because you know what trees are? Crops, right? Well, I don't know, but this is what it is. And so that's who is in charge of the U.S. Forest Service and in charge of all of our national forests. National forests are pretty sweet because you are allowed to do a lot of things on them, unlike a national park. In fact, the National Forest encourages and demands that they be used for multiple purposes or multiple uses. So you can do lots of things on it. For instance, you could log them, which seems odd that a national forest will let you do that, but they do let you do that. In fact, quite a lot of logging occurs. Or mining. You could also load up Mr. and Mrs. People McPebbles into a boat with their fishing rods and send them on down the river if they're in the national forest. Because you know what? If that's what you want to do, we're going to let you do it. The only other requirement is whatever uses you do allow, they have to be sustainable. So you can't just go log everything. The logging has to be sustainable so that the forest remains intact for the long term. So as long as you have multiple uses and they're sustainably done, you can do those activities on Forest Service land. This is just a pretty little map to show you where all the agencies' different lands are, and you can see there's not a whole lot of public lands on the east side, but on the west side, west coast, look at all those lands, and it's a lot of BLM land, see all that yellow, but definitely also a lot of Forest Service land. And those are kind of our big two agencies. And if the whole government thing and agency thing isn't confusing enough, which it should be because it's the government and things are confusing in the government, then let's throw in another little wrench into the works here. There are these things called wilderness areas, and wilderness areas are a little confusing for people because they are not operated by any one agency. So, for instance, the National Park Service doesn't control all of the wilderness areas. Wilderness areas are picked out by Congress as areas that are going to have be managed with little to no human influence. So that means when you go visit, you have to get permission to go visit in a wilderness area, and then when you visit, you can't leave a trace of your presence behind. So that means you can't just drive on up to the wilderness area and dump all your crap out and leave it there. You're going to have to packing everything out. And we have one of these here in Minnesota. It's called the Boundary Waters. Look at this lovely young lady here. She's so enthusiastic. She's like, I got to carry this canoe all the way up the portage. That's right, girl, because you're in a wilderness area, and you don't get to drive it straight up there. You got to carry it around, and that's kind of fun. So you should go to them. They're pretty awesome. All right, so since we talked a little bit about BLM lands and then talked a little bit about what rangeland was, since we just mentioned the Forest Service, I got to give a little bit of props to my forests out there. Whoop, whoop, what's up, forest? And so before we talk about forests, we should talk about how do you end up getting to a forest. And really what we're talking about is what happens to plants once they start growing in a community over time. And so basically this is the time will happen, and basically over time plant communities change, and we call this process succession. In the beginning, when there's no plant communities, it's called rock. There's just rock, and then eventually from rock little bits of tiny little plants or plant-like things like lichens and small grasses may start to grow on that rock. Not a lot, but there's going to be some that grow. They'll die, create some soil, and then make the soil a little juicier and thicker, and then that means more types of plants can grow, and those grow and die, and then that means we get a different change in plant community, and as the soil gets better, we get young forest and adult midlife crisis forest. Then we get old forest, and we call it old forest climax community, so that's a good thing. The beginning things here, the beginning species here are the pioneers. So the succession is just the change in the vegetation over time from pioneer species to a climax community. Well, now you say, how many different types of succession are there? And I say, gosh, I'm so glad you asked. And the answer is 2, you weirdos. 2, primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is when succession has to start like from the very beginning, like where there ain't nothing to success upon, all right? And that means there are no vegetative communities. So here's like Hawaii. Oh God, Hawaii, it's just basically this farty material in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's just farting out magma, and it comes on up and it's going and it's leaving rock behind, and there ain't nothing there but rock. It's such a mess. And so then what has to happen? Well, if a plant wants to live there, it's going to have to start from scratch. So all these little rocks are going to weather away, and then they're going to make little bits of soil, and then eventually one tiny little plant's going to grab a hold and start to grow there. And this is the start of succession from the very beginning. So primary, where there wasn't anything, not even soil there to begin with. Secondary succession is down here. So a lot of times communities have to go back through the succession cycle a little bit to get back to the climax stage, but they don't have to start completely from scratch. So for instance, a forest fire came through this little forest here. That is so sad. Run, Bambi, run. And so Bambi's running and freaking out, but doesn't have to freak out too much because it's thinking, Bambi's knowing, hey, you know, there's still some soil, there's still some trees here. That means we don't have to go through the succession cycle for very long. And in a short few years later, we have some regrowth and everything's progressing back to the climax stage. We should probably mention all the different kinds of forests that exist out there, and there's a lot of different kinds, but we're only going to talk about 3 big classes. First, there's old growth, which are so dang cute. Oh my gosh, they're beautiful. You know why? Because nobody's disturbed them. Lay off our forest, people. It's an old growth forest, our forests where nobody's been jacking around in them for hundreds of years. So we're not cutting them down, burning them down, we're just leaving them alone. So that usually means the forest is in a peak climax community. Climax communities don't actually have a lot of biodiversity in them because it's only the climax community. But what is in there is usually really rare because we've cut most of our forest down. So we have some unusually cool species in there. Second growth forest would be what we see in this picture here. So here was a forest, and then we cut it down, and then right here is the regrowth. So that would be the second growth forest. So it's regrowing after some sort of disturbance. We see secondary succession happening. There's going to be more biodiversity there because the disturbance is going to create a mixture of different types of ages of forest, and you get different types of creatures coming to it. And the third type of forest is a tree farm. So this really isn't a forest at all. It's literally a farm. We just monoculture a particular tree. So here's a Christmas tree farm. Ooh, look, triangle shape. Yay, hold snow well. And then this is good because we get lots of products out of it, but it's definitely got low diversity. And our final little discussion is, so what is the current state of forests around the world and in the United States? Well, sadly, this is not a happy story. In the world, most of our forests have been cut down. Since like pre-major human settlement times, over 8,000 years ago to today, about 46% of the world's forests are estimated to have gotten cut down or removed. This is called deforestation. Most of this has occurred in the last 100 years. Why do we cut forests down? Because we want to grow food on them. And so that's the big thing with the tropical rainforests. We're cutting them down, burning them, and growing food. The U.S. also has a similar story. We used to have a lot of forests before European settlement. Then once Europeans were here in the 1700s, 1800s, we cut a lot down. That's what this graph is showing here in the north and south east coast. And then actually since 1900s, we've seen a little bit of an upswing. And that's because people realized, oh my gosh, we had so many forests getting cut down, we've got to improve this. So there's been a lot of secondary growth that's occurred. Again, this is listing here the benefits of the forest. I think we've gone over this a lot in class. Forests are pretty friggin' cool. They do a lot of important services. Well, with that, people, we are done. So I want you to go out, grab your goat, take them outside, celebrate your public lands, go to a national forest, pasture, seashore, scenic river, and say, bah!